It was called the M1, but Lights, or Leica, of course, had a camera already called the M1, and so it was agreed that they would change the name of the Olympus to the OM-1. There are some M1 bodies in existence, some were sold, and those are very collectible. Hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again, and welcome to another episode. And today we're going to take a look at these beautiful little cameras from Olympus, the OM single digit series. That is the OM-1, which I'm holding in my hand here, the OM-2, and we're going to talk about also the OM-3 and the OM-4. Now these are beautiful little cameras, and when I say little cameras, they actually are quite small. They're smaller than the competition. The bodies are smaller, the lenses are smaller, but for some reason they were overlooked, sometimes overlooked anyway, by photographers, by professional photographers, by brands like Nikon and Canon. They sort of stole the OM's thunder to some extent, but these were professional quality cameras, and the professionals that did use them found them to be extremely reliable, just really good workhorses of cameras, and very light and portable if you're traveling and if you've got to carry one around all day as well. That's a really good point of these cameras. They are a little quirky to operate. They're a little bit unlike other film cameras in certain respects. The shutter speed control is not where you expect it, and the lens release mechanism is not where you expect it. And for that reason, they've sometimes been called the Saab of cameras. Saab was a line of cars, if you don't know, they're not made anymore, but they were a line of cars that were often quite quirky and had unusual design features. So these cameras were originally released in the early 70s with this first model, the OM-1, and it was originally destined to be called the M1. I think probably after its designer, Mr. Maitani Yoshihisa. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if not. So it was called the M1, but Lights, or Leica, of course, had a camera already called the M1, and so it was agreed that they would change the name of the Olympus to the OM-1. There are some M1 bodies in existence, some were sold, and those are very collectible now. So if you find one of those at a bargain price, you know you're looking at something very rare and special. But all the OMs are nice cameras. It doesn't matter what sort of markings they've got on them. These are beautiful little cameras, and they're probably a lot better than you might expect. So there's our Olympus OM-1, and this one has the 50mm f1.8 on it at the moment. And if I show you the top deck, you'll see what I mean about the control system. Here we've got the wind lever, that's conventional. We've got the shutter button, that's conventional, but here where we'd usually find the shutter speed dial on, say, a Nikon or a Canon, we've got the ISO dial. There's an on and off switch. This is an entirely mechanical camera, so the on-off switch really just switches on the meter. There is a light meter inside this camera, and there's a readout in the viewfinder. Unfortunately, the meter on this one isn't working at the moment, and they can suffer from that fault. And you'll sometimes find that a cable going to the battery compartment, if you take off this bottom cover, you'll sometimes find a cable going to the battery compartment is responsible, because they can fray and break over time. This one I did check it for that fault, but unfortunately that's not what's happened to this one. This one does seem to need a little further work, but it doesn't matter because it's an all mechanical camera. So all you need is a metering system, a light meter or a light meter phone app, or one of these little clip-on light meters that you can get today. This is the Astrahori light meter. It's a very nice little thing. I reviewed that a little while ago. You will notice there is no hot shoe on the top of this camera, and these Olympus cameras had a screw-on hot shoe. Here it is. This one's still got its cover on it. This is actually for the OM-2, so it won't screw onto this one, but you can see there that it's intended to go on top of the camera like that and screw into the housing to give you a hot shoe. So you could clip a meter on there. However, these are made of plastic. Most of them are cracked. This is one of the very, very few that isn't. Most of them have cracked over the years. Why make this vital part out of plastic? I really don't know. It wasn't quite up to the job, and 50 years later, it's certainly not up to the job unless you manage to find one that's hardly been used. So that is a slight weak point of these cameras. The shutter speed control on all of these cameras is around the lens. It's a circular control that's around the lens there, and on this OM-1 we've got speeds from 1/1000th of a second all the way around to 1 and B. Now this camera's led a hard life, but it works very, very nicely indeed. Slow speeds are fine. Mechanically, this camera is lovely. I'll show you inside the back of this one. They're all basically similar. And inside you will find a Leica style cloth shutter. So be very careful not to point this camera at the sun with the lens cap off, or you'll burn a hole in your shutter curtains. So it is a Leica style shutter, and it's a very reliable mechanism. I've certainly never had any faults with it, and I've never had any problems with that arrangement. To take the lens off, you push, no, not that one, that's actually the stop down lever, that's on the lens, which is a little unusual. And then opposite that we've got this other control here. Are we focused? Yes, we are. We've got this other control here, and you push that to remove the lens. Now these cameras do have removable focusing screens. It's a fairly simple matter to just pull down the screen there, and we just flip a little control. Focus please. And there comes down the screen, and we can change that for any type of screen that we want to suit, to suit whatever type of photography that we're doing. So that's a nice feature of these cameras. You can't change the prisms, unfortunately. And one problem to watch out for with these is rot in the prisms, is decay of the prisms, because they were fitted with little rubber inserts or foam rubber inserts, and that foam decays, turns acidic, and it actually attacks the surface of the prism. So that is one thing to watch out for. Most definitely on the OM-1. I know the design was changed later. So the OM-1 is a great little camera. It's all mechanical, as I say. There's not very much to go wrong. And if it does go wrong, I think you stand a far better chance of getting it repaired than if any of the electronics in the later cameras go wrong. So the OM-1 is likely to be a very reliable machine for the years to come. Let's have a look now at the OM-2, which introduced another feature to the Olympus lineup. Here's the OM-2, and you'll notice that they're very similar cameras. They're, you know, if you didn't look hard enough, you could in fact confuse them. They're identical in size. They're not quite identical in layout, but they're very, very similar. So the OM-2 really is the successor of the OM-1, although the OM-1 continued to be made. The difference with the OM-2 is, whereas the OM-1 is a mechanical camera, all mechanically controlled shutter speeds, this one uses electronics. It has electronic shutter speed control. Now, so far I've had a few of these cameras, OM-2s. I've found them all to be reliable. I've not found one that the electronics don't work on. I'm not saying they can't go wrong, but they do seem to have stood the test of time and to be very reliable. And I think probably I prefer using the OM-2 to the OM-1 because it does have automatic exposure, aperture priority automatic exposure, plus manual if you want to use it manually. But even if you use it manually, all those shutter speeds are electronically controlled. So there are both cameras side by side, the OM-1 here and the OM-2 here, and you'll see that they are very similar in layout on the top deck, except that where the OM-1 has only a ISO dial or an ASA dial, film speed dial, this one has a film speed dial and an exposure compensation dial as well. So that's a handy feature that the OM-1 doesn't have. We've got the switch in the same position. We can switch it either to auto, that's aperture priority, auto exposure, my favourite shooting mode, or we can turn it to manual, where you read out the settings in the meter, in the viewfinder, and enter them manually into the camera yourself. So a very similar setup to the OM-1 and a very similar appearance. Now, this camera introduced a really interesting design feature, which is called off the film metering. And what that means is, instead of reading the light that is in the environment around it, what the meter does is read the light that's actually hitting the film. So that was an advance, and it gives a much more precise, or in theory anyway, gives a much more precise readout of the light that's coming into your camera, because it's measuring the light that's actually hitting the film, not just the outside light in the surroundings. This camera has the Olympus 1.4 50mm on it at the moment. That's a really good lens, especially if you stop it down a little bit. It gets really sharp and really nice. And in fact, I'll show you now how that hot shoe attaches, because this is the one for the OM-2. It's very simple. It just screws on the back there. But I think the problem with these is that over the years they get screwed down a bit too tightly, and of course plastic is only has a certain amount of strength, and eventually they will crack. They weren't really up to the job. But that's the camera with the hot shoe attached. I tend to use them without the hot shoe these days because these shoes just aren't really up to the job. Underneath is the same, and you can get the same fault with the cable going to the battery holder. So if your meter's not working, then check that. That's the first port of call. But a beautiful little camera. even more beautiful the right way up, and a very, very, very nice little machine to use. So that's the OM-2. There were various sort of sub-models and categories of these cameras. There was the OM-1, there was the OM-1N. This is the Olympus OM-2 MD, OM-2N MD, and I think those denote the kind of flash systems they can use and that kind of thing, but they're all generally very similar machines. So that's the OM-2, and this camera is a variation on the OM-2. This is the OM-2 SP, or Spot program, and it's a very similar camera to the OM-2. But it's not the same. It does have a few differences. Like all the Olympus OM single digits, it feels the same in use. It's not really any different to operate. But it is a slightly different camera. It has a spot metering function, which is more accurate than simply getting a general reading off the whole area. And it also has a program mode as well, which does everything automatically for you. And instead of the removable hot shoe, we've got a hot shoe actually built in on this one. So there's our OM-2 SP, and let's have a look on the top deck. You can see that the top deck is a very similar arrangement. We've got the wind lever here. We've got the shutter button here, again in a very conventional position, just where you'd expect to find it. We've got the same exposure compensation and ISO dial here that we had on the OM-2, but there is the fixed hot shoe, and I think personally that's a much better idea. I think that really isn't going to suffer any wear and tear, and you're going to be able to use that just as much as you want. The removable hot shoes on the OM-1 and the OM-2 are a little bit tricky, but this one is going to stand firm over the years, so that's a good thing. The switch, you'll see, has 3 positions. What have we got? We've got manual or spot program. Focus, please. Thank you. We've got manual or spot program, and then we've got aperture priority auto, and we also have the program mode and a battery check, which gives a little beep if there are any batteries in it, which there aren't in this one, and there is a reason for that, which I'll come to in a moment. You'll see that the shutter speed dial is in the identical position to the OM-1 and the OM-2. That's a concentric ring around the lens mount, and the controls for stopping down and releasing the lens are actually on the base of the lens itself, just the same as the OM-1 and the OM-2. And this is a very, very nice camera, except it has one little peculiarity that you do have to watch out for. And that little peculiarity is battery life. These cameras, if you leave them switched off with the batteries in, will run the batteries down in about 6 months. I've heard reports that there are some that don't do that, but this one certainly does it. That's why there are no batteries in it at the moment, because when I last put a fresh set in and left it on the shelf, when I came to use it again, gosh, they were all run out. So it's heavy on batteries, and you do have to, it's wise anyway, to just open the battery chamber there and remove the batteries if you're going to leave this camera in storage for, gosh, longer than a week, really. I did read that you could, if you set it to B, if you set the shutter to B or to 1/60th, which is a mechanical speed, as I understand it. The batteries won't run down, but they still did. So there, so much for that. However, apart from that fault, this is a beautiful little thing. Nice hot shoe built in, very cool looking little camera in the classic camera style. Now, Olympus didn't stop there. They released the OM-3 in the 1980s, which I don't have because that's a very rare and very expensive camera. It's an all mechanical camera, and there weren't that many made. It had a very complex multimetering system, and it was quite expensive at the time. And because the OM-1 was still being made, which is also an entirely mechanical camera, then there weren't that many OM-3s actually sold. So OM-3s are very rare and very expensive, and that's why I haven't got one. But by all accounts, they're a nice camera. I don't know if the later cameras, the OM-3, the OM-4, the 4Ti, I don't know if they suffer from the same battery drain issue as this OM-2 SP. Perhaps if you have one, you could let me know in the comments. The OM-4 is less expensive than the OM-3 and has the advantage of multi-spot metering also, and more advanced electronics. Olympus did update these cameras and did update what they were doing with them as time went by, and the OM-4 is pretty much the ultimate. There were a couple of models after that, but they didn't have this same classic camera styling, so I'm sticking today to the OM-1, 2, 3 and 4. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the OM-4 is an electronic camera with auto exposure. So the later OM cameras, the OM-3 was mechanical, the OM-4 is or has aperture priority auto exposure or manual, a choice of either, similar to the OM-2. So if you're considering buying a nice film camera, a pro level film camera, I suggest you consider either an Olympus OM-1 or an OM-2. They're both readily available. They're not particularly expensive. In fact, they're less expensive than Nikon cameras. You can buy certainly an OM-2 with a lens for under £150 very often. The same with an OM-1 if you are careful and patient. So they're not particularly expensive. They're very, very nice cameras, and they're well worth considering if you're looking for a really nice 35mm camera. Now, as well as the single-digit cameras, Olympus, I'll just mention in passing, did do a line of double-digit cameras, the OM-10, the OM-20, OM-30 and OM-40. This is an example of the OM-30. It's actually much lighter than the OM-1. I hadn't realised the difference in weight. These are not pro cameras. These are amateur cameras. They were aimed at the amateur market. They're very, very nice cameras, and they accept all of the fantastic Olympus lenses. However, they're not rated for as many shots. They weren't guaranteed for as many shots as the pro models were, the single-digit models. So if you're considering one of these, make sure that it's not led too hard a life and that it's not too old. That doesn't really apply to the single-digit cameras, which are rated for a much higher number of actuations. As to my favourite, I would have to pick the OM-2. I must admit I've not used the OM-3 or the OM-4, but having used the OM-2 SP, which is similar to the OM-4 and the OM-3 in certain ways, I would still choose this OM-2. It's simpler, it doesn't have the battery drain issue, it's got that fantastic classic camera look. You can shoot it in manual if you want to, or auto exposure, aperture priority auto, that is, if you want to. However, as for which will prove the most reliable over the long term, I would put my money on the OM-1. It's a mechanical camera. Mechanical things will always be repairable. Electronics may not. And although this one is holding up very, very well after 40, 50 years, this OM-2, the electronics in this OM-2, there's no telling how long they'll continue to behave themselves. So for longevity, I would say an OM-1 every time. So there we are, 4 fantastic cameras from Olympus, which are well worth considering if you're looking for a really nice quality pro level 35mm SLR. So I guess that's it from me for this one. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been of some use. Many, many thanks to everybody who supports the channel and who watches. Many, many thanks to subscribers. Thank you very much for your support. And many, many thanks go to patrons also. Many thanks for your support too. So, as for me, that's it for this week. And as usual, if you're not doing anything too difficult, troubling or irritating next week at around this time, please do join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.